The Future China Global Forum is back with a big bang. Get business insights and discover future trends on China's development all in one forum.
Let us now invite our special guest, Deputy Prime Minister Tharman, on stage to deliver his speech.
Let me first say that we all, especially in Asia, but we all around the world, have a vested interest in China's continued transformation and its successful transition towards a more fully market-based economy, an inclusive society, and an innovative country. We have a vested interest in this. Everyone will do better if China successfully transits towards being a fully market-based economy, an innovative one, and an inclusive society. Remember too that China is not just about economic and financial policies. China is also embarking on an ambitious program of social reforms in healthcare, in the household registration or hukou system, in education, in social security. And these two are extremely complex. They carry their own costs and challenges, including political costs, but these two will determine if China makes a successful transition. China is at a more complex stage of reforms now. More complex partly because of the legacy of past overhangs. The past overhang, especially in heavy industry, excess production, overhangs in property, overhangs in debt, corporate debt especially. Very serious challenge. And it complicates the longer-term transition that China has embarked on. It is the most complex challenge of any major economy in the world, but a better chance of addressing and resolving the challenges. Put another way, if you look at all the major economies in the world, the US, the European economies, Japan, India, I would say China is a little unique. However, although China is unique, not just in having that clarity, but also its sheer scale and diversity, it is not completely unique. The laws of market economics operate in China just like they do everywhere else. And I will mention in particular three forces of a market economy that are particularly relevant at the current time, that affect China just like every other economy. First, and forgive me if this sounds too obvious, when supply persistently exceeds demand in any industry, the end result will have to be unemployment or subsidies from the rest of society to preserve employment, which is really disguised unemployment, or a reduction in wages and living standards for people working within that sector. Secondly, if debts cannot be repaid by income generated by the borrower, eventually the value of debts diminishes. It doesn't matter whether it is formally written down in the books of banks. It doesn't matter whether it's moved from one bank to another institution. It doesn't matter how the debts are moved around. If debts cannot be repaid by the income generated by a borrower, eventually the value comes down. And thirdly, postponing the recognition of short-term problems and postponing the adjustments that are required in the short term always leads to the problems getting larger and the eventual fallout also becoming more serious. And in that context, in the context of that third basic principle of a market economy, over-reliance on monetary policy to solve what are essentially structural problems never works anywhere in the world. It doesn't help structural adjustment, it usually weakens structural adjustment. And that is true everywhere in the world today, in the US, in Europe, and in China. Over-reliance on monetary policy. Even now, despite recognition of the problem, credit continues to grow. And as the economists would put it, the credit intensity of production, the credit intensity of GDP, let's say, continues to go up. So for every 1% of GDP, you get a rising amount of credit in order to fuel that, which means less and less efficient use of credit. Monetary stimulation cannot solve this. In fact, it works the other way around. Monetary stimulation will impede the necessary adjustments. The basic problem is not about whether to expand credit or reduce credit. The basic problem is how to get a better allocation of credit. Because even today, the state-owned sector is crowding out private enterprise in the capital markets. If you look at the rate of interest on loans to private enterprise in Wenzhou and other places, extremely high rate of interest, which means there's a shortage of funds for private enterprise and too much credit is going to state-owned enterprise. So even today, that is the case. And even today, they're still borrowing in order to repay old loans. It will not, in my opinion, lead to a financial crisis in China because the debt is mainly domestic. China has a very strong central bank and central government balance sheet, and it has a current account surplus. I'm not myself concerned about the risk of a financial crisis in China. The real issue is whether the way in which short-term problems are addressed affects longer-term growth. That's the real issue. The real issue is the economic cost coming out of the lack of a decisive approach to dealing with the short-term problems. What is the long-term prospects for China? The key is productivity. China can't rely on labor force growth. In fact, labor force growth is already, for the next 5 years, a small negative, and will become a larger negative once we are past 2020. Productivity growth will rest in China, just like in Singapore, just like in the United States, on what happens within each industry and within each firm. It's micro, not the macro reallocation of resources. And there's still tremendous opportunity for China to grow its productivity. The level of productivity is very high already in China. They're near the frontier in parts of manufacturing, some parts of e-commerce. But overall, China is at about 20% of the level of the United States. Still tremendous scope for what the economists call convergence. Convergence with the frontier. Convergence with the leading economies. Tremendous scope. There's also tremendous scope of convergence within China, not convergence with the external frontiers, but convergence within China. Tremendous scope because of the diversity in levels of productivity and efficiency and skills around China. But there's a challenge, and the challenge is dealing with not just creation, but destruction, and dealing with the geography of creation and destruction, because the creation is not taking place in the same places as the destruction. And where jobs are being destroyed, there's a challenge of creating new industry and new jobs. This too is a challenge all over the world. China's challenge is much smaller now compared to in the late 1990s, but don't assume it'll be easy, because it's a concentrated problem, older workers, not easy to reabsorb. And don't assume that because China does not have a political democracy, that the political problem is easier. Do not assume that. So it's left to be seen how well China will deal with this challenge. I think it will be able to deal with it in a fair way. It has the resources. China has a very strong chance of emerging in 5 years' time a transformed economy and society, not up to the maximum ambition, but a transformed society. And unfortunately, that's not something that can be said for any other major country in the world. Thank you very much.
The Future China Global Forum is organized by Business China with support from our sponsors and partners.